The man who would go down in history as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born on January 27, 1756, in Salzburg, an Austrian city nestled in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. His full name at birth was Jonas Chrysostomus Wolfgang Theophilus Mozart, although from adolescence he preferred to call himself Wolfgang Amadeus, a Latinized version of the Greek Theophilus, which means loved by God. His father, Leopold Mozart, was originally from Augsburg in Bavaria and had moved to Salzburg as a young man, where he managed to establish himself as a violinist and composer at the court of the Prince Archbishop. There he met Anna Maria Pertl, a woman of humble origin, whom he married in 1747. Of their 7 children, only 2 survived infancy. Maria Anna, better known as Nannerl, born in 1751, and Wolfgang, the youngest. At that time, Salzburg was an ecclesiastical principality governed by a prince archbishop who held both political and spiritual power. Fortunately for the Mozarts, the archbishop who reigned at the time of Wolfgang's birth, Siegmund Schrattenbach, was a great lover of music and wished to make his city a leading musical center. The Mozart family lived at number 9 Getreidegasse, in a 3rd-floor apartment in the middle of the old town, right at the foot of the hill leading up to the imposing Hohensalzburg fortress. There, music was their daily bread. Leopold organized musical gatherings with friends and gave violin lessons to earn a living. In 1756, the same year Wolfgang was born, he published a violin treatise that became a didactic reference. In 1763, he was promoted to vice-chapelmaster of the Archbishop's Music Chapel. Around 1759, when his daughter Nannerl showed interest in the keyboard, Leopold began teaching her to play the harpsichord. Little Wolfgang, barely 3 years old, watched her with unusual attention for his age. He soon began to play with the same exercise book that his sister used. By the age of 4, he was already learning violin and organ under his father's guidance. One afternoon, when Wolfgang was 6, 2 of Leopold's friends visited the house to play string trios. The boy asked to play the second violin part, but his father did not allow it. Then Johann Andreas Schachner, one of the visiting musicians, encouraged him to follow along with the score. To everyone's surprise, Wolfgang did so without mistakes, reading at sight. Then he took the first violin part and, despite his tiny hands and unorthodox technique, played all 6 trios from beginning to end with accuracy. On another occasion, Leopold found him scribbling ink on paper. The boy explained that he was writing the first movement of a harpsichord concerto. Examining the manuscript, Leopold was astonished at how well structured it was. He only remarked that it was very difficult to play, to which Wolfgang confidently replied, "Then you will have to practice more. These early compositions have reached us as numbers K. 1A, 1B, and 1C, referring to the catalogue of Mozart's works compiled by Ludwig von Kockel in 1862. In January 1762, shortly before Wolfgang's 6th birthday, Leopold took his 2 prodigy children to Munich, where they impressed Elector Maximilian III. Shortly afterward, he obtained permission from the Archbishop to undertake a trip to Vienna, partly funded by the court. On September 18th of that year, the family departed for the Austrian capital, stopping in Linz, where they gave their first public concert. News of those virtuoso children quickly reached Schönbrunn Palace. On October 13th, the family was invited to perform before Empress Maria Theresa. According to Leopold's account, Wolfgang not only dazzled the court with his skill, but even jumped onto the Empress's lap and showered her with kisses, provoking laughter from everyone. Despite his growing fame, during a second visit to the palace Wolfgang fell ill, probably with smallpox or scarlet fever, which caused concern in the Empress about the excessive pressure being placed on the child. Once recovered, and with Europe relatively calm after the end of the 7 Years' War, Leopold set out in 1763 on an ambitious grand tour of Europe with his family. The tour took them through cities such as Munich, Augsburg, Frankfurt, and Brussels, where Wolfgang played the keyboard blindfolded, covered by a cloth, to the delight of the audience. At one of those concerts, a young Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was present. In Paris, they performed before King Louis XV and Madame de Pompadour, and soon after, in April 1764, some of his compositions were published for the first time. The next destination was London, where they were warmly received by King George III. There, Wolfgang composed several sonatas, dedicating one of them to Queen Charlotte. After more than 15 months in England, the family was persuaded to visit The Hague, but the children's health suffered and both fell seriously ill. Wolfgang came close to death. It was not until January 1766 that he was able to play again alongside his sister. Shortly after, they returned to Paris, then to Switzerland, and finally to Salzburg at the end of that same year. Despite having spent more than 3 years away, which interrupted his formal education, Leopold personally instructed his children in subjects such as mathematics, geography, and history. Although some began to suspect that it was the father who composed the works attributed to his son, the Archbishop of Salzburg put him to the test, locking him up with a religious libretto and commissioning sacred music. The result was a set of 18 arias and recitatives that marked the beginning of his career as a dramatic composer. If you love music, at the end of this video I am going to reveal you the best books for musicians, such as practical guides for learning to play the piano, inspiring biographies of great composers, and books on success secrets that reveal the discipline and creativity needed to thrive in music. Find them in the description. In 1768, at only 12 years old, he composed his first complete opera, La Finta Semplice. Even so, many Viennese musicians refused to be directed by a child, and suspicions about the authorship persisted. That same year, Mozart survived a smallpox outbreak in Vienna that left him temporarily blind for 9 days. Miraculously, he recovered completely, something uncommon in an era when 1 out of 4 patients died. But the illusion quickly faded. Although Archduke Ferdinand showed interest in hiring Wolfgang, his mother, the Empress, ended the conversation with a lapidary phrase, "I do not think they need a composer." Her reasons may have been financial. The empire was going through a severe economic crisis after decades of war. Or perhaps she simply did not wish to see her son surrounded by artists of low rank. Whatever the case, once again, Mozart's talent was celebrated but not rewarded. Disappointed, the Mozarts returned to Salzburg at the beginning of December. There a new loss awaited them. Prince Archbishop Sigismund Schrattenbach, Wolfgang's faithful patron since childhood, had suddenly died. His successor, Count Hieronymus Colloredo, a cultured, enlightened man but severe and authoritarian in temperament, took office. Nevertheless, he recognized the value of the young Mozart and, in July 1772, appointed him concertmaster of the court. At only 16 years old, Wolfgang obtained his first official salary as a musician, 150 florins per year, in addition to the respect implied by his new title. That same year, father and son undertook their third and final Italian tour. This time, the commission was the opera Lucio Silla, centered on the figure of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, dictator of ancient Rome. The work had to be ready to premiere on December 26th, and Wolfgang had only a few weeks to compose it. Even so, he managed to meet the deadlines and exceed expectations. Lucio Silla was a resounding success, with 26 performances at the prestigious Teatro Regio Ducal in Milan. Mozart seemed destined for greatness. But once again, no permanent position materialized. Praise did not translate into contracts. Leopold, tireless in his determination to secure a worthy future for his son, returned with him to Salzburg visibly frustrated. The following year, 1773, marked a turning point. The Mozarts traveled to Vienna with the hope of obtaining the position of Kapellmeister at the imperial court, a post that would soon become vacant. But their hopes were in vain. The royal family ignored them, and Wolfgang was not invited to perform in the aristocratic salons. The excitement over the child prodigy seemed to have faded, and now the young adult had to make his way in a competitive musical world full of rigid hierarchies. Back in Salzburg, far from the bustle of the great cities, Mozart took refuge in composition. In a single year, he wrote 7 symphonies, among them Symphony No. 25 in G minor, one of the few he wrote in a minor key. Its emotional intensity, with bold melodic leaps and an almost tragic energy, makes it one of his most performed pieces today. He also devoted himself to the genre of the string quartet, composing a series inspired by Joseph Haydn, whom he deeply admired. In 1774, the Elector of Bavaria commissioned him to write a comic opera, La Finta Giardiniera, the pretend gardener. Mozart moved to Munich in December with great expectations, but the premiere, on January 13, 1775, turned out to be a failure. It was his first operatic setback. The audience did not connect with the work, and the reviews were lukewarm. That blow affected Wolfgang deeply, who began to question whether his artistic path really had a place in the great courts of Europe. The following years were hard. Between 1775 and 1777, Mozart did not receive any significant commissions. Even so, those years allowed him to mature as a composer. Up to that point, his piano concertos were adaptations of other composers' sonatas. Now, for the first time, he began to write entirely original works for piano and orchestra, starting a phase that would define his legacy in classical music. In 1777, the situation in Salzburg worsened. Archbishop Colloredo, determined to cut expenses, dismissed several court musicians, including Mozart. With no other options, Wolfgang decided to travel again. But this time, his father would not accompany him. For the first time, he had to face the world on his own, with his mother Anna Maria as his only companion. On September 23rd, they left Salzburg in search of new opportunities. They first passed through Munich, where they hoped that Elector Maximilian Joseph would receive them with some proposal. Mozart even approached him in person to remind him of his achievements, but the answer was blunt: there are no vacancies. As compensation, a group of private patrons offered him an annual stipend. It was not what they were looking for, but at least it allowed them to continue their journey. The next destination was Augsburg, Leopold's hometown, where Wolfgang was reunited with his cousin Maria Anna Thekla, with whom he would maintain an intense correspondence full of humor, wordplay, and risque jokes. The stay in Mannheim marked another milestone. There he met the Weber family, particularly Aloysia, a young soprano with a promising voice. Wolfgang fell madly in love and dreamed of traveling with her to Italy. When his father learned of this idea, he was scandalized and ordered him to continue his journey to Paris, the true goal of that tour. The stay in Paris was a disaster. The French aristocracy showed no interest in his music, and the conditions in which they lived were precarious. Worse still, his mother fell gravely ill. On July 3, 1778, Anna Maria Mozart died, alone and far from home. Heartbroken, Wolfgang delayed informing his father. When he finally did, Leopold harshly blamed him, convinced that, had Wolfgang not insisted on that trip, his wife would still be alive. Despite the pain, a ray of hope emerged in August of that same year. Archbishop Colloredo agreed to readmit Wolfgang as Concertmeister, this time with a salary increase of 500 florins. Mozart accepted, on the condition that he could travel from time to time. Before returning to Salzburg, he passed through Munich, hoping to see Aloysia Weber again. But the meeting was painful. The young woman no longer showed interest in him. According to reports, after a cold rejection, Mozart said goodbye ironically, singing a coarse improvisation at the piano before leaving. In January 1779, Mozart returned to Salzburg, almost 23 years old. The brilliance of his childhood as an international prodigy seemed to have faded. He had lost his mother, his first love, and the possibility of obtaining a position at a great court. However, something inside him had changed. He was more mature, more determined, and his music was beginning to reflect an unprecedented emotional depth. Between 1779 and 1780, he composed some of his most admired works, the Coronation Mass and the Sinfonia Concertant for violin and viola, pieces that show both his technical mastery and his ability to touch the human soul. Although he remained under the strict eye of Archbishop Colloredo, destiny had already prepared a new stage for him, Vienna, where Mozart would leave an indelible mark on the history of music. After his return to Salzburg in 1779, Wolfgang had managed to partially rebuild his life. He had once again taken the position of Concertmeister, regaining a certain economic and creative stability. However, his relationship with Archbishop Colloredo remained tense, and his growing artistic ambition increasingly clashed with the strict rules of the Salzburg court. Deep down, Mozart knew that his future was not in that small city, but on a larger stage. That opportunity would finally arrive in 1781, with a new move to Vienna, the imperial city where he would find both his artistic consecration and his greatest personal tragedies. Vienna was, at that time, one of the most important musical centers in Europe, and Mozart quickly made a name for himself among the local nobility. Although he initially arrived as part of Colorido's entourage, tensions between them exploded when Mozart refused to accept the humiliating treatment he received, including having to eat with the servants. In May 1781, after a particularly violent argument, Mozart resigned from his post in Salzburg and was expelled from the archbishop's residence. From that moment on, he began his life as an independent musician. Settled in Vienna, Mozart found an unexpected refuge in the Weber family, whom he already knew from Mannheim. His former passion, Aloysia, was now married, but Wolfgang reconnected with the family and soon focused his attention on the younger sister, Constanze. The relationship was intense, with several ups and downs, breakups and reconciliations. Finally, and despite his father's opposition, they married on August 4, 1782, in St. Stephen's Cathedral. Although Leopold never fully accepted the marriage, Mozart firmly defended his decision, convinced that Constanze was his ideal companion. In the following years, Mozart's career reached new levels of success. In March 1783, at a memorable concert at the Burgtheater, he presented his Piano Concerto No. 13, part of a series he had composed that winter. He realized that by combining his role as a composer with that of performer, he could attract a wider audience, and he organized a series of concerts in which he himself played the piano and conducted the orchestra. It was a brilliant strategy, both artistically and financially. However, despite having promised to visit his father in Salzburg, Mozart kept postponing the trip with increasingly unconvincing excuses. Winter was approaching, he had musical commitments, Constanze was pregnant. He even came to fear that Colorido might arrest him if he set foot in the city again. Finally, on July 29, 1783, Wolfgang and Constanze arrived in Salzburg, leaving their newborn, Raymond Leopold, in Vienna under the care of a nurse. But the visit was tense. Neither Leopold nor Nannerl had approved of the marriage, and Constanze felt rejected. Worse still, a few weeks later, on August 19th, they received the devastating news that their son had died. Not even this tragedy managed to fully reconcile the family. Even so, during that visit, Mozart premiered one of his most striking sacred works, the Great Mass in C minor, with Constanze as the soprano soloist. Although the work remained unfinished, the movements performed in October 1783 left a deep impression on the audience. On his way back to Vienna, Mozart composed in just a few days his Symphony No. 36 in C major, known as the Linz, which he premiered in that city during a brief stop in November. Now definitively established in Vienna, in 1784 he moved with Constanze to the Trattnerhof building, where he gave private concerts in a large hall. There he developed one of the most fruitful stages of his career as a concert pianist and composer. Between 1784 and 1786, he wrote a series of 12 piano concertos, numbers 14 to 25, many of which are considered among the greatest in history. Particularly noteworthy are number 21 in C major, celebrated for its lyricism, and number 25, a majestic work whose first movement foreshadows the grandeur of the future Jupiter Symphony. That same year, Constanze gave birth to their second son, Carl Thomas, who would survive into adulthood. His professional success was also reflected in his finances. Mozart earned close to 4,000 florins annually, a remarkable sum. However, his desire to live like a gentleman, with luxurious clothes, lavish dinners, and an apartment next to St. Stephen's Cathedral, soon led him into debt. In his eagerness to integrate even further into aristocratic circles, he joined Freemasonry, a social and philosophical network that was booming among enlightened men of the 18th century. He was admitted to the Lodge Charity and soon attained the rank of Master Mason. Freemasonry had a notable influence on his later music, including works such as the Magic Flute. At the beginning of 1785, after several refusals, Leopold finally agreed to visit Vienna. Although he complained about the exhausting pace of commitments and concerts, Constanze cared for him with dedication and managed to soften the relationship between them. The reunion also allowed Mozart to show his father the fruits of so many years of struggle. Leopold was moved to see how the aristocrats congratulated him on his son's talent and proudly recounted that Emperor Joseph II himself had exclaimed, "Bravo, Mozart." During that stay, another memorable moment took place: the visit of composer Joseph Haydn to the Mozart household. Considered the greatest living composer, Haydn was deeply impressed by Wolfgang's compositions, especially his 6-string quartets, written as a tribute to him. After hearing them, Haydn said to Leopold, "Before God and as an honest man, I tell you that your son is the greatest composer I know." After Leopold's departure in April 1785, Mozart established a new artistic collaboration that would mark the beginning of his most famous operatic trilogy. He met the Venetian librettist Lorenzo da Ponte. Their first joint work, L'Unase di Figaro, The Marriage of Figaro, based on a comedy by Beaumarchais, was a direct satire against the nobility. Despite its subversive nature, they managed to obtain imperial permission to premiere it at the Burg Theatre on May 1, 1786. It was an immediate success, with nearly 40 performances in just 5 years and an enthusiastic reception in Prague, where Mozart premiered his Symphony No. 38, known as the Prague, considered one of his greatest orchestral works. Thanks to this success, the Prague Theatre commissioned a new opera. Thus was born Don Giovanni, premiered in October 1787. Although technically an opera buffa, its tone was darker, with the figure of an amoral seducer who ultimately is dragged to hell. The reception in Vienna was more lukewarm, but in Prague the work was another triumph. With this opera, Mozart consolidated his status as the greatest operatic composer of his generation. That same year, Vienna received the visit of a young talent. A certain Ludwig van Beethoven, only 16 years old, arrived with the hope of studying with Mozart. Although it is not known for certain whether they formally met, the encounter between these two brilliant minds, however brief, symbolizes the passing of one musical era to another. But 1787 also brought sadness. In May, Leopold Mozart died. The relationship between father and son, marked by both admiration and conflict, was sealed by death. Shortly afterward, Wolfgang and Constanze lost their little daughter, another emotional wound in a year of contrasts. Even so, Mozart did not stop. In 1788, amid a growing financial crisis derived from the war against the Ottomans, he composed his final great symphonic trilogy, Symphonies No. 39, 40, and 41, the latter nicknamed Jupiter for its majesty. They were monumental works, of a maturity and complexity that marked the culmination of musical classicism. But recognition was not enough to cover the debts. In 1789, he embarked on a tour of Berlin, Prague, Dresden, and Leipzig, seeking new sources of income, while Constanze, pregnant again, remained in Vienna. Upon his return, he found her gravely ill, a situation that would repeat itself in the following years and deeply affect the composer's emotional and financial state. Thus, while his art reached unforeseen heights, the shadow of illness, grief, and economic instability began to darken Mozart's final years. The brightest composer of his generation was entering the last stage of his life, with some of his most immortal works still to be born. Despite the recognition he had achieved as a composer and performer, the last years of Mozart's life were a whirlwind of contrasts. Masterpieces were born amid illness, financial anxiety, and the constant threat of infant death. The birth of his daughter in November 1789, who lived less than an hour, was another devastating blow for the family. The tragedy did not halt his creative activity, but it marked a clear turning point in his emotional life. At the end of that same year, Mozart embarked on his third and final collaboration with librettist Lorenzo da Ponte, Così fan tutte. The title, literally translated as Thus Do All Women, was a comedy of romantic entanglements, light in appearance but with profound philosophical implications about fidelity and human nature. Although it has since been the subject of debate for its cynical tone, its premiere in January 1790 was well received. However, the sudden death of Emperor Joseph II in February abruptly cut the series of performances short. The court entered official mourning, and many productions were cancelled. Aware that his position as chamber composer depended on imperial favor, Mozart decided to travel to Frankfurt that autumn to perform during the coronation of the new emperor, Leopold II. There he performed his Piano Concerto No. 26, later known as the Coronation Concerto. But despite his efforts, he failed to secure an official post. Leopold's court was more reserved and less interested in the Enlightenment ideals that had favored Mozart under Joseph II. During his absence, Constanze demonstrated a rarely acknowledged practical intelligence. She renegotiated a loan at a more favorable interest rate and moved to a more modest apartment, momentarily stabilizing the family's finances. At the end of 1790, Mozart and Haydn were offered the chance to make a joint tour of London. Although Haydn accepted, Wolfgang declined, afraid to leave Constanze, pregnant once again. That decision sealed a definitive moment. They would never see each other again. It was the end of one of the deepest musical friendships of the 18th century. At the beginning of 1791, Mozart premiered his Piano Concerto No. 27, his last in the genre, a delicate and melancholic work that seems to foreshadow his imminent end. In May, he received an appointment as assistant Kapellmeister at St. Stephen's Cathedral, with the promise of promotion to the titular post, and a considerable salary when it became vacant. It was a belated but important recognition. Shortly afterward, Emanuel Schikaneder, a theatrical impresario and Mozart's fellow Freemason, proposed that he compose the music for a fantastical and symbolic opera, Die Zauberflöte, the Magic Flute, written in German and not in Italian as most operas of the time. The work combined fairy tale elements with Masonic symbols and a strong moral message. At the same time, Mozart received a mysterious commission. A masked man requested a requiem. At first not knowing who it was, Mozart soon deduced that the commission came from Count Franz von Walsegg, an aristocrat who had the habit of purchasing works to pass them off as his own, this time in memory of his deceased wife. Thus, Mozart worked on three fronts: the Magic Flute, the Requiem, and a new opera commissioned by the Prague court to celebrate Leopold's coronation as King of Bohemia. This was La Clemenza di Tito, a work on the virtue of imperial forgiveness inspired by the Roman Emperor Titus. Constanze gave birth to their sixth child, Franz Xaver Wolfgang, on July 26th, and, against all odds, accompanied her husband to Prague for the premiere on September 6, 1791. The reception was cold, although over time the opera would earn respect. Much warmer was the reception of the Magic Flute, premiered on September 30th in Vienna. The public packed the theater and Der Wien for weeks. The opera mixed the popular with the profound, the humorous with the symbolic, and soon became one of the favorites of the Viennese repertoire. Mozart, already weakened by fatigue and chronic illnesses, attended each performance whenever he could, visibly moved. But death was approaching. During the autumn of 1791, Mozart fell gravely ill. His body was exhausted after years of relentless work and economic pressure. He began to express fears of having been poisoned, alluding to aqua tofana, a legendary lethal substance of the 17th century. These remarks fueled a myth that would persist for centuries, that Antonio Salieri, his rival at court, had orchestrated his death. Although that story has been historically disproven, it inspired Pushkin in his drama Mozart and Salieri, which in turn became the basis for Peter Shaffer's play Amadeus, immortalized on film in 1984. As his health deteriorated, Mozart continued dictating fragments of the Requiem to his student Franz Xaver Sussmayer from his bed. He did not manage to finish it. In the early hours of December 5, 1791, barely 2 months before turning 36, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart passed away. 2 days later, he was buried in Vienna's St. Mark's Cemetery, in a common grave, without ceremony or headstone. The exact causes of his death remain debated. Repeated throat infections, kidney failure, rheumatic fever, perhaps a combination of all. Despite the tragic and premature end, Mozart's legacy is immense. From childhood, he had been shaped by the rigorous education of his father, Leopold, and his precocious talent led him to travel across Europe. But it was not until his independence in Vienna that he truly flourished. He composed some of the most complex and moving works in the classical repertoire: symphonies, concertos, chamber music, sacred works, and operas that still resonate strongly today. Mozart was not simply a technical genius. His music conveys a profound humanity. The light laughter of the Marriage of Figaro, the redemptive yearning in the Requiem, the luminous nobility of his Piano Concerto No. 21, or the symbolic mystery of the Magic Flute. It is that ability to reflect the entire emotional spectrum that makes him one of the greatest artists in history. Many have debated whether his music possesses the same tragic depth as Beethoven's or the structural refinement of Bach's. But his genius, his versatility, and his melodic instinct are indisputable. Would he have surpassed Beethoven had he lived longer? Perhaps. What is certain is that, even with a life cut short, he managed to leave behind an immense catalog, with masterpieces that continue to move the world more than 2 centuries later. If you enjoyed the story of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a life full of genius, passion, tragedy, and beauty, don't forget to subscribe to continue discovering the lives of the great composers who transformed the history of music. Here you will find more fascinating stories, from the imperial salons of Vienna to the last notes written on a deathbed. The history of classical music is full of emotion, intrigues, and immortal works, and we have only just begun.